I think often I underestimate how the doer principle, the movement in life that comes from the belief in doership, which really means that when certain thinking, certain actions are happening, that they're accompanied by a belief, a thought, maybe not necessarily one that is actually functioning in the conscious, but is somehow embedded in the movement, in the thinking, in the action, that says, this is me, the doer, this is something I'm achieving. And I underestimate that, I guess, because from my own experience, in the seeking, when it started, the notion of watching, I think was to some extent present in my life already. And so just a few hints that said life is happening meant that it wasn't hard for the seeking that had started to be seen as a happening. And so if this distinction isn't made, then the doer principle that may be active for someone and isn't even seen to be active because it's always there, it's always been part of the movement towards whatever is happening, that there may not be the frame of reference, meaning someone's own experience may not be such that there is an understanding that it can be different. And so when something's always been one way, always been there, then it's not always clear that what is being said is pointing at that, because it just seems normal. It doesn't seem like there's another way of doing it. So I thought it's worth talking about what it means everything is a happening, and why the teachings that throw out information, how they are happening, are they talking to a doer? Are they telling a doer to do something? So one of the nice sayings that goes along with this topic is the saying that is thrown out in the teaching from time to time, that no matter what the words sound like, no matter what words are written, they're never a prescription of something to do. They're always a description of something that happens, a dynamic that happens in life, or a description of something that might happen. So never a prescription of something to do, always a description of something that happens or might happen in life. So an example of this is the statement that happiness for the human being is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And peace of mind is the end of suffering. So it's a statement, it's a description. It's not telling anyone to go and achieve continuous, unbroken peace of mind. It's not telling anyone to resist suffering when it arises. What it's doing is it's just a description of something that can happen or something that does happen in the flow of life. So we can see that peace of mind is the absence of suffering, meaning that when suffering is present, it's not peace of mind. And when suffering falls away, then it's peace of mind. So it's just describing what we can call different looks of life, different experiences. The presence of suffering, we can't call that peace of mind. The absence of suffering, we can call that peace of mind. So when the doer principle hears this, what it hears is, peace of mind, which is happiness for the human being, is the end of suffering. Thank you for telling me that, Roger. Now I know what I need to do. I need to bring about the end of suffering. And so then this statement comes in. Whatever is said here, no matter how it sounds, even if the words that are used make it sound even more like a prescription than the example I've just given, because really when we look at it, the example I've given is quite clearly just a statement. Enlightenment is the end of suffering, or human happiness is the end of suffering. It's just a statement. The doer automatically hears statements, especially about things it thinks it needs, and it says, oh, okay, so inevitably, it doesn't matter that you've said it's just a statement, really it's something for me to do, something for me to achieve. And so if it's heard that way, what happens is the doer is given more fuel to keep moving, to keep existing. And so this is why a lot of teachings actually never give these sort of descriptions, because they understand that if we give a description of an end point to a doer principle, what's it going to do? It's going to try and achieve that. And if the aim of a teaching is to bring about the end of the belief in doership, the end of the functioning in doership, what a lot of teachings say is actually this idea that there is something to achieve, the idea that there is somewhere to go, is part of the problem. Drop any idea of anything to do or anywhere to go. So instead of giving a description of what human happiness is, rightly so, it's a valid methodology, they say there is no goal, there is nowhere to go. And it's ironic because it's also true, but at the same time we can describe what is available right here and right now. When certain movements of doership stop, what's here right now is peace. When suffering stops, there is peace right here, right now. So it's available to everyone right here, right now, if suffering were to just stop. But you see, suffering can't just stop if certain conditions are in place. If certain conditions are in place, then it forces suffering in its mild or intense forms to be there. So what's the teaching doing? The teaching is part of the situation at a particular point in time, just like the conditions that might be there that force suffering to arise. And the teaching is simply being thrown out by life in order to bring about new conditioning that might change the conditions that force suffering to be there. And one of the helpful bits of conditioning could well be the description of what we're looking for. It can also, that very same description can be what creates more suffering and prevents what we're looking for from being recognized. So that's the dilemma. Do we put a description onto what we're looking for, a description that can be very helpful, and at the same time a description that, if taken the wrong way, can cause its own problems? So it's useful to put the description out there as long as we can put these cautions along with it. So the caution is that whatever is being said is not a prescription. It's just a description of the dynamics of life or what might happen. So the end of suffering might happen. Not because anyone achieves it or does it, but because it may be part of the story of life. So why is the description about what human happiness, why could it be important? It could be important because if it's received and the right line is taken, which means it's information that is useful, but I'm not going to turn it into an objective. I'm not going to turn it into something I insist on being here. So to know that there is a possibility that life can be an experience where suffering is not present is useful information. As soon as we turn it into an objective, that's what I want. That's what I'm going to achieve. Now we've taken useful information and turned it into something that is going to have to be dissolved at some point. An objective, an expectation, and a movement of the doer. So because our true nature is witnessing, having a description of what life is can be useful because we can use the description for attention to land on certain aspects that we didn't see before. So when we're witnessing life, we might witness life with suffering present, and we might witness at another time life when suffering isn't present. And then we understand, without having gone there, without having achieved it, without having done it, we can see how a description, even if we don't turn it into something to achieve, something to do, can be very useful at directing awareness to become aware of something it didn't see before. So even if the statement comes out like, abide in I am, that sounds like a prescription. It's a prescription to abide, to do something. Abide is a verb, a doing word in the English language. So we say, okay, well that means I have to abide in I am. It's a description of something that might happen. There is a set of suggestions that I put forward sometimes in relation to the practice, which is also not really a practice, because when we look at it, we can see it just happens. There's no one practicing. It happens because the set of suggestions about how this happens are put forward. So soften your gaze, allow the whole moment to arise into or fit into your field of vision, allow the center of consciousness to drop into the heart. Remember, none of what is being said is a prescription. So allow is not talking to someone and saying, do it. It's saying, notice it might happen. So allow the center of consciousness to drop into your heart is really a description of something that might happen. At some point, the center of consciousness might drift down out of the head into the heart. The gaze may open up, and the complete vista that fits into the field of vision may be recognized. And then, as awareness lands on certain suffering thinking, the thought, I am, might arise. Why might it arise? Because this is being suggested, that the thought, I am, is as good a thought as any, in fact better than some, to bookend, to cut off the obsessive thinking. And the thought, I am, is essentially inside it, it's loaded with a whole lot of wisdom. The thought, I am, summarizes our understanding that suffering, when it's happening, is a happening, not my doing. It summarizes the fact that there is an understanding that suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself stemming from a false set of beliefs about who we are. There's an understanding that this suffering arises because somewhere in the system it's assumed that this sort of thinking is helpful, that this sort of thinking is going to get us somewhere. The sort of thinking I'm talking about is regret in the past, expectation in the future, expectations of how I should act and how the other acts, complaining in the present. All of that thinking, somehow in the system we do it because we think it's useful, but we've also seen it's not useful. So in this I am, there's the understanding it doesn't serve any purpose. It can just, if it stops now, nothing has been lost. In fact, a lot to be gained, silence. And so all of this is summarized in the thought I am, which can bring about a stop. So actually I started off with the open your eyes, allow everything to be in it, and allow the center of consciousness to drift down into the chest area. In this practice of I am, what happens first is the recognition of suffering. Usually if we're in that state of the soft, open gaze, suffering has already stopped. So it starts off with awareness landing on the obsessive thinking. We realize, oh, I've been caught in thinking for half an hour. And awareness sees the thinking. Automatically the thought I am comes up with all its understanding in it. That thought becomes the bookend to the thinking. And simultaneous to the I am, that's when the eyes soften, the gaze opens, and an allowance of the sense of being, or the center of consciousness, to drop into the heart. We might find that when this obsessive thinking is happening and the thought I am comes up and we drop into being, and when you drop into being, hopefully you can feel the sense of existence and the function of awareness, that which is aware of the present moment. Hopefully there's a sense of that, but the fact is that we may get dragged out of that place of being, which is a field that is outside of thinking. We may get dragged out of it very quickly, half a second, back into thinking. And it might take us 10 or 15 minutes before awareness lands on the fact that, wow, that was quick. I don't even know how long I spent in being. We just sat there for a minute. That was quite a long time of just being. It might actually be that we're there for about half a second and then dragged back out into thinking, and it might take 15 minutes before there's actually awareness of the fact that we're back into the thinking. And that's okay, because as soon as awareness lands on that, which is not something we do, right? Just like I mentioned yesterday, if a glass falls and breaks, the sound is heard and the head turns. We are convinced that that is my doing, I turned my head. The head, the body, the mind is programmed to be curious and to react to certain sounds. So as soon as a sound happens, it's heard. We didn't choose to hear it. The sound was within the field of awareness. So it's heard, and the body turns automatic. It's really as automatic as the heart pumping. It just feels like I do it, so we don't treat it the same as a mechanical movement of the heart, which we quite clearly don't feel like we are doing. But it's the same. And the same with awareness landing on obsessive thinking. When the obsessive thinking makes enough noise, or when the working mind has been conditioned in such a way to be on the lookout for obsessive thinking, then the working mind and awareness can land on the obsessive thinking. And it happens when it's going to happen. it happens when it does happen. And it's a happening. And as soon as awareness lands on the fact, there's a subsequent action. So like cause and effect. So in the same way, if the glass falls and breaks and we turn over and see it, and we see a baby crawling in that direction, and there's smashed glass on the floor, we suddenly get up to pick the baby up. It's not my doing, the whole thing is a series of happenings. If I hadn't heard the glass break, I wouldn't have looked over. If I didn't look over, I wouldn't have seen the baby. If I didn't see the baby, I wouldn't get up. If I looked over because I heard the glass break, I saw the glass broken and there's no baby, then I might think, I'll leave that for someone else to clean up, or I'll clean it up later. There's no reaction of standing up because the circumstance doesn't require it. And so we're going back to this abide in I am. And we're seeing how the word abide in I am is not really an instruction for anyone to do anything. It's just a description of what might happen. And how does it come about? How might it happen? It comes about because there's been certain conditioning thrown out by life, received by the body. The body is now conditioned. The awareness and the working mind is on the lookout as a machine, not as a doer. The working mind is not what I am, it's a machine. And awareness is always just aware of things. So at some point, awareness and the working mind recognize the obsessive thinking. And from then, another reaction happens. The thought I am automatically arises. If the doer principle is in there, right, this is where I started off. If the doer principle automatically is in there because life is just seen as my doing, so this new conditioning that's pointing out that life is just happening, life is just happening, life is a happening, life is a happening, not your doing. If that hasn't been brought out, then the doer principle is going to be in all of this. If it has been seen, then I am might arise automatically, not as something that the doer is doing. And I am arises as a thought, and it cuts off the other thinking. And then simultaneous to that, there's an opening of the gaze, a softening of the gaze. The center of consciousness drops into the heart, and I find I am. Not as a thought this time. The thought I am is the final thought just before we drop into being. And when there's that being, then we know, not with the mind, but the direct experience. We know I am. We know I amness. Being is I amness. Being, inherent in the beingness, is the sense of existence. So the word I am is just used to address, to label this sense of existence, which is not a thought, and it's not something we bring into existence in that moment. We don't have to make ourselves, the I am is there, it's always there. And so we drop, and now we know I am. I just had a nice idea. I'm going to describe it one more time, and then I'm going to stay in I am until there's a reason not to. Which really means until someone asks a question or until something else to talk about comes up. So as we're moving through the day, doing whatever we're doing, this is why it's not a practice. No one has been told that they have to sit for an hour and do this. Just living your life. And because of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes all of what I've been talking about, awareness lands on some obsessive thinking, blaming our partner for what they've done or what they didn't do. And as soon as awareness lands on it, the thought I am arises. And in that I am, there is a lot of wisdom that's been understood, that this sort of thinking doesn't get us anywhere. I know that I used to think it got me somewhere. It's actually the obstacle to being, that this thinking, when it stops and we drop into this other field of existence, everything is okay. Circumstance remains more or less the same. Our partner still has done or hasn't done whatever we were blaming them for, and yet the blame gets cut off. So awareness sees this, the thought I am arises, cuts off the thinking, gaze opens up, center of consciousness drops into being, and I am.
Animals don't have this sense of doership, do they? I mean,
No.
they don't. Just what happens. I mean, even if they seem angry and they attack other animals or other maybe people, they don't blame them for something, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. It's the intellect of the human being that allows this belief in personal doership to be formed. It seems, based on observation, that the intellect of an average animal is not developed enough to conceptualize one's own existence. However, in the case of the human animal, the intellect of a human is sufficiently developed such that it can conceptualize its own existence, which is what allows for the capacity of liberation or enlightenment to happen, is because the existence is able to be recognized in a way that can't happen in an animal. It also is what allows the intellect to go in the opposite direction and cause all of the drama, the human drama, that an animal doesn't face. So an animal doesn't know how to suffer. Its intellect isn't developed enough to conceptualize a me and develop a story about what is happening relative to this conceptual me. So they don't suffer, but they also don't get to appreciate what they are in the same way that a human can, because of the sharpened intellect. So Ramesh used to call the gift of the intellect the dubious gift of the intellect. Like, is it a gift or is it not a gift? And it can be both. It depends which way it falls. So when the intellect at the age of a young age becomes aware of the experience and then starts drawing certain conclusions about me and who I am, and it gets it wrong, and then that's when the doership identity gets put in place. And so to say all animals are enlightened is not exactly correct. We can say that animals don't suffer, they experience pain. So let's not mistake pain and suffering with each other. So clearly, if an animal is squashed into a cage with a lot of other animals, it's not pleasant. They can even die of circumstance. And so they have physical pain. But they don't suffer in the way humans suffer. And so often what happens is humans project onto animals human emotions, human capabilities that an animal simply is not capable of. And so humans think that animals are suffering beyond the pain that they have to endure. This thinking that the animal is, having human emotions of suffering. So this allows for an elaboration on, pain in the moment is going to be there, always going to be there. The load of suffering is an additional load on top of the pain. A load that includes this false idea of who we are, and in it there is an inherent uncomfortableness with ourself and with the other and with life. And the animal doesn't have that. So the animal experiences pain, no doubt, but doesn't create this extra load of suffering. And so we hear stories about, Ramana's cow being enlightened. So if I say this, I'm sure many people watching are going to go, no, this is not true. Ramana said his cow is enlightened. It's a concept. Everything that is being said is a concept. don't take any concepts as truth. Even the concepts that the most great sage puts forward is a concept, not truth. So just because Nisargadatta said something, don't believe it. Use it, don't believe anything anyone says. But certain people have concepts that are very useful for certain things, and so we need to relate to them correctly. We use the concept and see what it's trying to demonstrate, what it's trying to show, what it's pointing at. So Ramana can say his cow is enlightened simply because he might be trying to point out that his cow doesn't have suffering thoughts. And that's not to say that just the absence of suffering is enlightenment, because then we go around in circles and say, well, in that case, his cow is enlightened. But he's trying to show that aspect of it, that for a human being, in order for them to recognize themselves, first there needs to be the absence of suffering. So to the extent that we point out that suffering is the veil, suffering is the problem, if a concept does that efficiently, then it's great. It's not a concept that is absolutely true from all angles, but it's there to serve a purpose. I'm quite sure Ramana's cow didn't suffer. I'm not sure that Ramana's cow had the capacity to conceptualize its own existence. So I'd like to just go over the definition of choice. Or do you want?
But the principle, like I am, is there in other forms also, or
Yes.
like it seems like.
It's true. So the question is, okay, so how important is this conceptualizing one's own existence? And from what I would suggest is that the I am is there because a dog knows that it is separate from other things. So when a man with a stick is coming and that man has repeatedly beat the dog knows to run away. It knows that it is this, not this, but its body. It has that sense, so it moves away. The self-realization, so the self is there. The self-realization is not only about it being there without suffering, but it turning in on itself, it recognizing itself. So there's plenty of times when suffering is not active and the self is not realized in a human, because the attention guided by the working mind, we can say, some curiosity, some interest, isn't directed there. And so the self is always there. It just doesn't necessarily turn in on itself and recognize itself. And it seems that in this process, the realization where self becomes aware of itself is not, it's not automatic. It doesn't mean that if suffering isn't there, that self does become aware of itself. So, and when we observe, a lot of times when this happens, self becoming aware of itself, especially on a stabilized basis, so it can happen out of the blue. That's often what starts people's journey. They have an awakening out of the blue with no seeking, so that can happen. But that actually just becomes the initial impulse for the thinking to start, for the curiosity to start, for the seeking to start. And so then the process is a process where the intellect starts to become involved, and if the intellect gets sharpened in the right way, and it becomes a very powerful tool at guiding awareness onto itself. So that's my explanation.
Yes, this I saw now from my experience that when this happened, this pull gravity, the thoughts, some of them are like really still, it doesn't appear, but then you see the thought and there is like gravity, or this natural state is more like doesn't want to go out from there, and there is like a peace. And there may be another thought, like a biologically come up, but there is no interest. It's like a peace.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's more like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably got to do with, when we're resting, knowing ourselves, and knowing that there is this self-contenting existence, self-affirming, self-fulfilling, meaning it doesn't need fulfillment from outside.
Yes.
It's self-fulfilling. Then the obsession with thought is like, it's fallen away. It's sort of like when you've eaten and you're full, you're not really that interested when they come past with the tray of food. It's like, oh, I'm full, so the tray of food can go past and you don't reach for it. You're satisfied. And so the more and more we rest here, the less and less energy that gets given to these thoughts. They're not interesting. And they still happen because there's a momentum, there's a store of energy of those particular types of thinking, and so they still pop up, but we're not interested in them.
Yes.
And at some point, resting in our being long enough, we come to know our true nature, and that knowing uproots the ingrained false ideas about who we are. It's like, the ingrained belief says, I am X, Y, and Z, and we rest here knowing I am. So X, Y, and Z is known to be a story.
Yes, and it's like more feeling that you're untouched from out of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's kind of strange, if like you are always it, like, it's like you couldn't not be it, so the idea that you're something else is actually a fiction. So how come you have to understand, that you are something that you are, or it's a strange loop. It's you cannot even get it by the intellect. It's like, if you can speak all these.
Yeah, the intellect part is really, it's there only while we don't get it. Is it important that the intellect gets given this information, so that the intellect can cut off the opposite thinking. So the strange thing is that what's been put in place is a false idea of who we are. When you think about it, how strange to not know who we are. It's a strange concept, and yet it seems like this story of life has been specifically designed for a not knowing to be the standard, a mistake, a misunderstanding of who we are to be the standard, as in the default setting. And so whilst the default setting is in place, the way it gets undone, and so the default setting of not knowing is like a sheet, a veil that covers up the self, which is there, but it just doesn't get to be seen whilst this phantom is in place. And so the intellect gets equipped with enough information to keep seeing the phantom, as false. And because the intellect and the phantom are all part of the one brain, there's the working mind and the thinking mind. And the working mind, which is part of, it's the one brain, but we're sort of conceptually creating a distinction between the two. The working mind gets equipped, effectively programmed to understand that the very machine that is being programmed with this new information is faulty somewhere else. And so the new programming is effectively catching out the old faulty programming. And as it does that, the whole machine is being reprogrammed. And once the machine is reprogrammed, the program at some point has nothing more to do. The new programming, the concepts, the spiritual concepts, their only job is to get rid of what's in the way. And once it's done that, then the new programming doesn't carry on functioning. It knows to stop. And then the self knows itself by itself. So the self doesn't require the intellect to know itself. But as part of the reprogramming, as we spoke about before, the reprogramming is simultaneously pointing awareness inwards. The reprogramming is saying, take a look inside. Take a look at what is looking. So awareness becoming aware of itself. And then once that's happened, and once it happens enough that such a simple movement, which we didn't know how to, the body didn't know how to just stop and be, because the body, the brain thought it has to keep even stopping, it has to do stopping. And it didn't realize that stop means stop. Stop and be. So it then knows itself, and it just, as you said, it's not an intellectual thing. So knowing oneself is not in the slightest bit intellectual. But coming to know oneself is the job, or not the job, but is done with the intellect being very active in that process. So what I find is when I listen, there's a lot of times when certain nuances are not pointed out. And so words can be thrown around flippantly in a sense. So the saying that exists, the love, well, actually how it's popularized, what we hear often is money is the root of all evil, right? Everyone's heard that, I'm sure. Money is the root of all evil. What is actually said is the love of money is the root of all evil. But, what does the brain do? The brain's sort of a bit lazy, so it just says, oh yeah, money is the root of all evil. It's not what it says. Different. The love of money is the root of all evil. So in that saying, love of money means attachment in the words I use. So love means attachment. Money means pleasure. Evil means suffering. Root means cause. So attachment to pleasure is the cause of suffering. What the intellect has said is pleasure is the cause of suffering. Attachment to pleasure is the cause of suffering versus pleasure is the cause of suffering. So if we look at it the way it's popularized, it says pleasure is the cause of suffering, which really means that the flow of life, circumstance, is what makes me happy or not happy. And it's not true. We spoke about this morning. It's our attitude to the flow of life that makes me happy or unhappy. And if we don't see the difference, then we're not seeing things clearly. If we don't see things clearly, we will go round and round and round trying to solve life, trying to solve human unhappiness by solving the flow of life, by trying to make the flow of life pleasure, 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 and the flow of life simply by its nature is not pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. It's part of creation of duality, which means interconnected opposites, pleasure and pain. So we need to start seeing things for what they are to get clarity. So the word choice is another word that often at some point people say, I have no choice. And in this teaching, it puts forward the concept that everything in life is completely predetermined. Everything that happens throughout the course of the day, throughout the course of life, is happening because it has been created that way. Everything is a happening according to God's will. Everything is a creation. Everything is predetermined to happen exactly as it happens according to God's will. And at the same time, the teaching says, and there is choice. So let's put that aside. Let's look at everything is completely predetermined. What it means is that whatever happens is God's will. And so when someone sees this, and they see that there actually is no individual separate from what is happening. There isn't a separate individual that is disconnected and autonomous that can pull themselves out of the present moment flow of life. And it might even be seen that what the human being is made of genes and up-to-date conditioning and thoughts, and it's all part of the present moment experience. That might be seen, and if it's seen, it's like, so who am I? I realize that I am not that mechanical thing, and that there is no individual doer. That's seen. And so then we come to the conclusion, I have no choice. That whatever I choose, firstly, there is no I to choose. That's, let's say, what's seen. There is no I to choose. And whatever gets chosen is God's will. So whatever I choose in a moment is not my choice, but destined to happen. It was destined to happen that way. And so, on the one hand, it seems it makes sense to exclaim, I have no choice. Or there is no choice. Choice doesn't exist. But let's look at it on a nuanced basis. Let's let's look a little closer. And if we look a little closer, it's not quite right to say choice doesn't exist, because what unfolds, what is predetermined to unfold, unfolds through the mechanism of choice. In each moment, many choices are being made. Do I turn left or right? It's a choice. There's two options, left or right. Do I order orange juice, apple juice, or lemon juice? 3 options, and one is picked. So orange juice is picked, and orange juice turns up on the table or it doesn't, depending on if it's available or not. So let's say orange juice is picked, it's available, orange juice turns up. So what is being said is that it's destined for the orange juice to have turned up, and it was destined for orange juice to be picked, and it was destined for the person who picked orange juice to be in the restaurant. And it was destined for the person who was in the restaurant to be born at exactly the time they were born. And for everything in between the restaurant and the birth to have happened exactly the way it happened. So everything happened exactly as it was destined. So the choice of orange juice has already happened at the point. So is it right to say there is no choice? What we really mean when we say there is no choice is there is no chooser. There isn't choice as my choice. There isn't choice that comes from a separate independent entity, a separate independent chooser. So that's a great realization. So for someone to go around saying we have no choice, on the one hand it's great, high five them, great, you've seen that there's no choice, high five. Because really what I know they're saying is I've seen that there is no individual doer. Everything is happening and it couldn't have happened any other way. And then I say, that's great. What you really mean is the human is not in control of what they do. And you're using the word, there is no choice. Also, it's correct because our definition, it's saying there's no choice, is correct when our definition is choice being a doing word. In the English language, there is the assumption that if it's a doing word, there is a doer. And so choice automatically implies a me that is choosing. So when they see there's no me, they say no choice, based on the old definition of choice is someone's choice. If we redefine choice as simply the picking of one of 3 options, then we say choice happens, not as my choice, but as a mechanism of choosing one of 3 options or one of many options. So then, when it clicks, we stop making a statement that isn't really that accurate. We stop making a statement that doesn't see things as it really is, and we start saying, there is choice in life. The flow of life unfolds exactly as it's destined, and what is destined unfolds by choice being made many times in the day. But I just know that it's not my choice as a separate individual entity, as a separate individual doer. But choice, how can I deny that I open up the fridge, and why not call the picking of one option choice? It's fine. That doesn't disturb my understanding that there is no doer. It doesn't disturb my understanding that everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. But if I go around saying, I have no choice, there is no choice in life, then on the one hand, I'm seeing one aspect clearly, but on the other hand, I'm not seeing things as they really are, which is life unfolding as it's destined to unfold through many choices being made in life. We just have to be clear, it's not my choice. So that's a clarification on the word choice. And there was another word I wanted to clarify. But it doesn't come to me right now.
then we can say like a choice was made, like a story was made, and there is not in the story like a chooser who is made this choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's just flow of life, which happens through each body, mind, organism in that moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So one way that a sage simultaneously to living as if they are the human being making the choice, knowing that deep down everything is happening, simultaneously the sage sits back attitudinally and watches choices happen through a body-mind organism, just like you said. A sage sits back attitudinally and watches anger arising in a body-mind organism. Not my anger, but anger arising in a body-mind organism. Even if suffering were to arise, which according to these concepts, theoretically, doesn't arise in a sage. But if suffering were to arise, once the belief in personal doership was dissolved sufficiently, obviously not completely, because the suffering includes that doership in it, but to the extent that it arises and the understanding is deep enough, then suffering will be seen to arise in a body-mind organism.
Yes, thank you.
And yet, we still have the experience of simultaneously living as if I am the doer, as if I am the body, as if I am the chooser, with the deep understanding that fundamentally none of that is happening.
I just wanted to ask, how can there be pain without suffering? I mean, if someone comes and cuts your hand off, okay, and there's bleeding and you're in a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, don't you suffer? Isn't this suffering, or is in this sage is different? Like, okay, it's not his suffering. There's no my suffering, but the pain is the same, isn't it?
Yeah, if we use the word suffering like he had to suffer the pain, then that's suffering the pain. But there's a distinction being made here between physical pain and the enduring. So I use the word enduring pain. So a sage has to endure pain. And for all intensive purposes in the experience, that is my pain. Right? Not my doing, but my pain. Right? If there were two hands on a table, my hand and someone else's hand, and a hammer hits a hand, I'd rather it hit the other hand. Because if it hits this hand, it's my pain. If it hits the other hand, I don't feel it. Right? So pain has to be endured. When pain is there in the moment, it gets endured. So we're not using the word suffering here to relate to physical or different forms of pain in the flow of life. So if we become clear that there is pain of someone breaking their finger, the pain is there. Let's say someone else breaks the finger intentionally, and there is pain. Is there hatred for the other, for what they have done after the event? When the event is over, is there a story about hatred towards the other for what they have done to attack you? And usually, along with pain is a story that is a story about what has happened and what it means about me and what it means about the other person. And that story is an uncomfortableness with oneself. And does it have to be there? Does the story after the fact have to be there?
Yes, but for example, Nisargadatta had, let's say, he had cancer, so he must have had a lot of pain,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So the pain he had to endure.
Yes, and he felt it.
Yeah, he felt it.
And he felt it as his pain. I mean, understanding that it was pain arising in a body-mind organism, but in practical terms, it's experienced by his awareness. So there is pain, But is there an extra load of suffering that accompanies that pain? The extra load of suffering would be the thinking about, why is this happening to me? I shouldn't have smoked all those years. Nisargadatta was the smoker. I really should have lived life differently. Why is my family not looking after me when I'm in this pain? They're leaving me in this room on my own. All of that thinking is additional on top of the pain of the cancer. And it is thinking that can only happen if certain views of life and views of the other and views of oneself are in place. If they're not in place, it makes absolutely no sense. No, it makes no sense. It just doesn't happen. Or it doesn't make sense. It's like, why would I blame someone who's a character in a story for not attending to me? I'll have to suffer the pain of not being attended to. But to blame them is just an extra load of hatred and uncomfortableness. So I'll call for them to see if they come. But if they don't come, then that's pain. They're not coming when I need them to attend to me. But the additional thinking is the load of suffering. That is impossible for it not to be there if someone sees life a particular way, if they see the other as an independent doer. It's like, why aren't you coming? Why aren't you choosing to come based on your own free will? So you are hurting me, I hate you. So blame has to happen. If we see life a certain way, if we see it differently, then it's not personal, and the extra load of suffering doesn't make sense, and the sage will cry out in pain when the pain is strong enough. The crying out in pain is part of the flow of life, part of the biological reaction, linked to the pain. Is it clear that there would be a difference between experiencing the pain of cancer plus, on top of the pain of cancer, the fear of death, the anxiety, the worry about the fact that you're dying, and on top of that, hatred for your family members who aren't looking after you, and guilt for the past things that you've done? Can you imagine? So what it means is, the first version is you suffer, you endure the pain in peace. Meaning the pain is there, but it's allowed to be there. What to do? At best, you can express the pain through sound if it becomes intense enough, and maybe that serves some purpose. Maybe that reduces the pain or something. The other version is you endure the pain with the opposite of peace of mind. You endure the pain with this big extra load of suffering on top of it. And people know when they experience the difference that, wow, in the past when I experienced pain, the biggest problem wasn't the pain, the biggest problem was the suffering. What we find is that pain on its own, even in its intense form, without suffering, is manageable.
So there is like a lot of put on the genes, no? Like we have biological preferences. And like I was listening to Ramesh also, he told that some bodies needs, for example, more food or sex. They're orientated in some less, no? But there is also kind of psychological addiction to these same, let's say, things. So what would be the symptom or the difference, no, to feel, which is that my point is that you don't push something that is actually your biological nature, and on the other hand that you don't let something that could be or is it even the difference, like, so.
Well, you don't want to resist either, because both of them are effectively happening. Both of them are not your doing. So even if you are able to differentiate between the biological and the psychological, which is possible, and I'll talk about that, so if I forget to get round to it, remind me. But even if we are able to differentiate them, the purpose is not to differentiate to try and control, to try and resist or change it. Because if we do that, then that in itself is the movement of the doer principle. Remember, there is no doer, actually. There is just a belief system that can inhabit and drive the thinking, or be part of the thinking. And so, once again, in creating the conceptual distinction between the two, not so that we resist one and accept the other. So it's there because one is changeable based on life bringing about a reconditioning of the thinking mind, beliefs. So the psychological changes when life brings about reconditioning of the psychological mind, the thinking mind, and the biological remains more or less the same. And so knowing that, and then being able to investigate and see what the root of the thinking mind is, the root of the addiction, if you want to look at that, or the root of the suffering is the better way to say it. Then we can investigate that, because it can reveal the type of conditioning that is being pointed out here as being false conditioning, an error. And once we see the error of the root of the suffering, then the suffering, which is an error arising from an error, falls away. And that, once again, is just awareness landing on the dynamic and starting to see it. Awareness plus the working mind. So, how do we know the difference between the two? We have to feel the difference. Suffering is always an uncomfortableness with oneself. So, in my journey, when I started to feel suffering and be able to distinguish it from other things, at some point, the word uncomfortableness, which I had heard and read beforehand, I had this thought, this is such a great word for this feeling. It's an uncomfortableness. Now, I'm not talking about the uncomfortableness of sitting on a chair that is uncomfortable, that's physical. I'm talking about an uncomfortableness with oneself on an internal level. And so once it clicks that the feeling of suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself or an uncomfortableness with the other, which is ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself, once that clicks, in my case I went, wow, that is a great word for it, uncomfortableness. And then we know. And as the radar, effectively, the radar that has been programmed to pick up uncomfortableness, as that gets more and more refined, more and more finely tuned, then it can sense suffering in its mild forms. And when that starts happening, the working mind that has been equipped to understand that seeing what is at the base of this suffering is very important, that there's a story, that there's a belief at the base of that suffering. And so it requires, once the suffering is felt, to see what is the story. And often the uncomfortableness is there because someone hasn't done what they said they were going to do, for example. You'd signed a contract, two people signed a contract, and on the date that something needed to be delivered according to the contract, the person rang you up and said, I'm sorry, I'm on holiday, and I'm not going to be able to take up the position or deliver what I said I was going to deliver. And then there's this uncomfortableness. And at first, if we haven't come across these teachings, the fact is that the uncomfortableness is assessed to be completely justifiable, completely normal. I had a contract with this person, and on the day of delivery, they ring up and say, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to be able to deliver. And so we feel this uncomfortableness with the other, which is ultimately an uncomfortableness with oneself. And it goes completely unrecognized as a problem, although it is the problem. It is our unhappiness in the moment. And yet, we have no basis on which to think that it could be any other way. The guy can you believe the guy didn't come as he had promised on the very day we agreed that he was meant to be there? That's when he rang up to tell me. And so we tell everyone for the next month, all of our friends, and our family and anyone, strangers, can you believe what happened to me? This is, and have this story about it. And it's all uncomfortableness. And until the radar has become finely tuned and we have been given an explanation about what this uncomfortableness is based on, it goes unnoticed. When all of this has happened, suddenly we start picking it up, and then there's a curiosity. Hopefully a curiosity to know what is at the root, not an insistence that it's not there. And as we look, with this example I use, when we look at the example of this story, it's very clear to see what the story is. This person said they were going to do that, which would be delivering pleasure to me. And I agreed to pay them X amount for that. And on the day, they ring me up and they say they can't do it. So they didn't deliver the pleasure. And me not getting my pleasure is effectively pain in the moment. Pain in the moment is believed on some level to be an attack on who I am, because we believe that I need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete. And as a result of all of that happening on the subconscious level, then there is blame towards the person, and all of that is this uncomfortable feeling. And when we talk about addictions to things, an addiction to food or to sex or to cigarettes or to alcohol usually is there because there's a deeper uncomfortableness that arises, either because something happens in the flow of life and makes us feel uncomfortable, and so we then reach for that which makes it a bit better. So we have a cigarette, let's say. I don't understand this, but anyway, apparently that's pleasure. And the fact that now we have pleasure, when we have a situation that was taking my pleasure away, for a moment we go, pleasure, because we believe that that is my completeness. And so this becomes a circle, a vicious circle, of becoming addicted to something pleasurable to cover up a deeper uncomfortableness that comes from our attachment to outcomes. And so if we recognize that this uncomfortableness, that might be something that's historic, we might just have a general uncomfortableness with ourself, and anxiety or shame or lack of self-confidence, whatever, comes up, and then we move towards pleasure in order to feel better. if we can see that this is what's happening, then we might stop moving towards that pleasure, because we might see actually this is based on a belief that pleasure is somehow making me complete. I remember speaking to someone about this. They said that each night before they go to sleep, they have to have a bowl of ice cream. They said, I'm addicted to a bowl of ice cream before I go to sleep. And so I put forward this suggestion that it could be that a sense of uncomfortableness comes up from somewhere, and the bowl of ice cream has become what makes that better. And they thought about it, they went off, and it must have clicked at some point when probably the next night when they went to get their bowl of ice cream, they might have felt an uncomfortableness. And they saw, because they had an understanding, they saw how ludicrous it is that there's a thought that says a bowl of ice cream is going to make me complete. And they said from that point on, they no longer had ice cream before they went to bed. Because it is, when you think about it, that in practice it does make us feel a bit better. But all it does, it's like the Band-Aid over a big cut, that it creates a temporary relief, but it doesn't fix the problem. And so the other thing that happens with addiction is that there's an uncomfortableness. It drives us to indulge in certain pleasures. Like the feeling that I have to have that pleasure is so strong, because the uncomfortableness is so strong, that you can't resist it. So at some point you have to surrender. If you see this dynamic, you have to surrender to the fact that I'm forced to be addicted to this until some awareness, some new understanding comes in and changes something. When it changes something, like the example I just used, what previously was a dynamic that forced us, didn't give us a choice to indulge in something, changes, and we can find that there is a capacity not to indulge in it anymore. But until that point, what happens is the uncomfortable feeling comes up, we indulge in the pleasure which we really know we shouldn't, we have an idea we shouldn't be doing this, it's bad for me. And because we have this idea of a should and shouldn't, then we feel guilty for indulging in the pleasure. And what you'll probably find is that if we investigated the root of the original uncomfortableness that drives us to be addicted to something, the uncomfortableness could well be guilt, a sense that I'm not good enough, that I haven't performed well enough. That might have been reinforced when we were a child, something like that. And so that feeling drives us towards an addiction to something. And then we feel guilty for not being good enough, when I'm not good enough to hold back from that addiction. And so we feel guilty about the addiction. And if the underlying guilt is going to get undone, we first need to understand the principle of guilt and start applying the absence or the new attitude, which is an attitude where guilt doesn't make sense, not at the very deeply ingrained suffering. That's too hard to get guilt or to get non-doership, which makes guilt not make sense. It's too hard to get the principle of non-doership under the deeply ingrained uncomfortableness. Where it needs to start is in relation to the eating of the ice cream. So if we see that I was forced to eat ice cream, when I say forced, I'm sure many people say, no, I can hold off. So we hold off today, we hold off tomorrow, and then it's too much the next day. At some point we can't hold off. Right? So trying to use our willpower to hold off, it's like an elastic band. You pull it back further and further and further and further, and then it snaps. So I would surrender to the fact that life is forcing me to do this. Life is forcing me to have a bottle of wine. Someone who's addicted has the bottle of wine anyway, and then they feel guilty. I'm suggesting, well, that's not helping, that's not seeing the situation. See that there's an uncomfortableness, it forces you to have a bottle of wine. And don't feel guilty about that bottle of wine. I'm not saying it's good for you, right? But to feel guilty about it, how's that really helping? Guilt doesn't prevent us from doing something. Guilt forces us to do something. See, this is the trick. Guilt doesn't prevent us from doing something. Guilt forces us to do something. The feeling of guilt is an uncomfortableness with oneself, and that uncomfortableness with oneself forces us to try and fix the uncomfortableness. So have a bottle of wine, which is a happening, and see it as a happening, and say, not my doing. So it doesn't make sense for me to blame myself for that. And very quickly, that's a huge shift. You know, if we can not feel guilty about something we've spent our whole life feeling guilty about, and we know why we're not feeling guilty, not because Roger said don't feel guilty, but we see the underlying reason why I have the bottle of wine is because the urge that I don't create the urge to have a bottle of wine. The urge comes up and it's so strong, it forces us to do it. And so then we have the bottle of wine like we always do, because we're addicted, so we're always having the bottle of wine. And we do it without guilt. Something massive has changed there. And possibly, I don't know how life is going to turn out, but it makes a lot of sense that if you really sit back and don't feel guilt, it could well have an effect on the guilt that's deeper down. And we might find we're not that interested in having a bottle of wine anymore. It doesn't mean it's suddenly going to get rid of that underlying feeling, but it means a whole lot of light has come into the situation. And that light might create a situation like I mentioned before, seeing that actually this bottle of wine isn't a solution. And with that understanding, the urge for the bottle of wine might not be there. So remember, this isn't a strategy. This isn't like, I'm not talking to an addict and giving them a strategy where you can beat your addiction if you do this, this, and this. If the addict says, great, now I have a strategy, now I'm going to pretend not to be guilty, not to feel guilty about having the bottle of wine. Not feeling guilty comes when there's a complete realization. I'm not doing it. The urge is arising, and the body is forced to move in direction of the urge.
So the difference about biological.
Yeah, so it comes down to feeling the difference. A biological movement for something is not going to feel uncomfortable. A biological movement towards something is because it's our preference. And when our preference isn't delivered and it comes from a biological movement, there's no insistence that the preference be delivered. Whereas when it's coming from a desire, meaning an attachment to outcomes, then it comes up, and as soon as it's not delivered, there's this reaction of hatred or guilt towards the person that got in the way of it being delivered. Or a feeling like, I can't live without this being delivered. So we can see when we're attached to a relationship is when compared to a biological reaction. So if a relationship ends, you can have a biological reaction that is of sadness. Like, I'm sad that they no longer want to spend time with me. I enjoyed spending time with me, and I'm sad. But I'm complete. When it comes up, when we hear they don't want to spend time with us, and we feel completely devastated, you know, that it's a completely different feeling. It's like, as though I can't possibly live in this life given this situation. Completely unacceptable So there is an insistence that this situation is not like that. So that's the difference between a movement towards our biological preferences versus being driven by attachment. And in broader terms, it's about feeling the feeling and seeing if there is uncomfortableness or not.
Well, I have a question, but before I get to my question, just something that you said triggered something else. So, people often refer to Nisargadatta and how he was like a chain smoker. So does that mean that even without the sense of doership and without the sense of uncomfortableness, that the addiction can still remain?
Well, I wouldn't call it an addiction.
That would be a biological preference then?
Yeah, in that his preference, it could be a biological addiction, but not a psychological addiction. So with smoking, there's nicotine, and it could be a biological addiction. But it could also be that the preference is for that, and if it's available, why not have it? And that Nisargadatta's response, when someone said, you claim to be an enlightened... makes me laugh. You claim to be an enlightened being, and here you are sitting in a leopard skin or a tiger's skin, smoking beedies. And Nisargadatta, from what I hear, looked at them and said, I didn't kill the tiger, and I've been smoking all my life and I like it, why should I stop now? Still practical. Instead of all this idea that we have about what we should and shouldn't do, someone has killed the tiger, that's animal cruelty, and it is okay. I'm not for that, but the fact is that Nisargadatta was so much more present. It's like, oh yeah, it's a tiger. I didn't kill it, Take your issue somewhere else. In a sense, is what he probably told them. Get out.
Okay, so my question is, you use this phrase, dropping into being, and then earlier when you were talking about how when obsessive thinking arises, how we can abide in the sense of I am and then drop into the heart. And the heart you have described in other talks as being the connecting point between impersonal and personal consciousness. So is dropping into being the same thing as dropping into the heart?
Yeah, essentially at the time when you drop into being, you are in the heart. So, and the heart also, in a way, it's referring to the body, the chest, because the fact is that if we remain in our head all the time without realizing that, oh, there's a body here that I can feel. Like really, I know from my own experience that my intellect was active, and I think I was quite happy. I enjoyed contemplating. This is before even spiritual thinking. I was always creating theories about this and that. I used to enjoy it. It was fun, and at some point I realized, there's a body here that I can feel, and to actively bring attention into the body. And that in itself can be a movement that hasn't happened. So to realize that we're never going to know being when awareness is in the head. So it needs to come into the body to start feeling. The problem that sometimes happens is that the body often contains so much uncomfortableness in it that we come into the body and it's like, no, I don't want to stay here. This is not a nice place. I'm looking for peace, and this is not peace, so I'm going somewhere else. Where else is there to go? Back to the head? Well, how's that been working? So can come back into the body and maybe understand that it's uncomfortable because of this load of guilt and blame that may be repressed and held in the body. And based on what we were talking about this morning, that it makes sense to actually feel these energies and come to understand what the stories are, especially with our new way of looking at life. Then, okay, we come into the body and we say it's uncomfortable, but we have a reason for feeling those things. And in theory, if we could find, being is a place where thinking stops. And thinking, as I hope we're starting to see here, as I use it, doesn't necessarily just mean in the head. That these suppressed feelings and emotions are thoughts stored in the body. So when we come into the body, thinking needs to stop. But this sort of thinking that's in the body is just, it's not our doing. So can we drop behind that? Because in theory, even if the body is got a lot of this energy, if it's destined, this field of being is a field outside of all of that. The thing is, do we have access to that when there's all of that there? See, a lot of thinking, so even if it's just thinking in the head, when we hear being, so the thinking just wants to get there, and it only gets there when it stops, like when the brain realizes stop. And the thinking that's locked away is a bit different in that it's got a different quality to it. It just is running and it's in the unconscious. So stop is harder. So it really needs that to come up in here and then stop and drop into being. But we don't really need to worry about that because this process unfolds.
So what you were just saying, were you just saying that the subconscious thoughts that are stored in the body have to first come up into conscious thinking before they can be?
Yeah, to some extent. At least there needs to be more space. At first there could be so much packed into the body that there is no space to be able to drop beyond it, behind it. So if some of it starts coming up into the conscious thinking, and in the conscious we can then just stop. If the mind has figured out that it trying to get somewhere and do something with the thoughts is not stopping, and then at some point it's just the easiest of mechanisms, right? It's just like you're flicking a switch that is all so weighted to just fall. It's so easy, just no effort at all to flick the switch of stop. Only once you've found that switch, because it's sort of all the other switches, all the other movements of the brain, which are like big switches saying flick me, flick me, flick me. Right? They're the ones that stand out, and they're all the ones that aren't stop. And they're actually heavy switches, it's like really. And this other switch is just no effort to flick it, just stop. But only once we've found that is the switch. Until then, we're working all the other switches, flicking them, thinking that that's stopping, whereas it's actually the mind going and going. So once that switch is known, that dropping into being is known, it's helpful for some of the stuff in the body to start coming into the conscious, so it can be seen and felt, and then at some other points when it's in there. So remember, there's these two different movements: being, and at some other point, feeling the energy to release it and whatever. And we don't know which is the right time to do which one. It's just it's good enough that we know that they're both possibilities. They're both useful. So as it comes out of the body into the conscious, it can get processed up there. And once the body is light enough, doesn't mean empty, but light enough, then this dropping into being can happen more easily.
Well, so when you described going into the feeling, I didn't really think about the body component of that. I guess I was thinking of more the labels and getting to the underlying story. And I mean, I see that there is a physical component to the feeling, but does it? I don't know why I'm making this comparison, but you know how you sometimes talk about how when you first learning how to just do what you feel like doing, how that took some time to even feel what it is that you felt like doing. Does it take some time to become familiar with the uncomfortableness that's stored in the body?
Sure, yeah. We're not used to being there, so it takes some time to orientate ourselves with how to stay there and to get used to feeling. Yeah, so they're very related. Once I started doing what I feel like, which meant starting to become aware of my like tiredness and hunger, much more than I did in the past, because in the past my head was saying, well, they're not important. You've got other things, more important things to do. So often, I forget to go to the toilet even sometimes, and then realize I'm busting to go to the toilet. So it needed to scream at me to get me to and tiredness, same with and hunger. There'd be times when I wouldn't eat because I'm doing other things, and then it starts screaming at me. I realize, I've been hungry for a while. So starting to, and they're very obvious ones. There are more subtle feelings that are not just those gross biological feelings. So yes, when starting to feel what you're doing also means you start to feel the uncomfortableness as well. So they're very related, this dropping into the body and feeling. So, and the feeling is completely in the body. So what you said is putting labels. And so actually the labels only there and figuring out the story, only the labels to try and get the feeling to grow, all on a feeling level in the body. And the story more or less afterwards. You put the story onto it after you've realized that you've just smashed up a pillow in the name of hatred for your ex-partner, right? Then you can put the story to it. But feeling the emotion is about feeling it, not about thinking it into existence. And the click for me was when I realized people would ask me how I feel, and I'd go up to my head and say, and look for an answer. And I realized I'm answering the question based on the image or what I think the right answer is, rather than actually feeling. Not that people really want to know how you feel when they ask how you're feeling. It's still good to give them a generic answer. But it clicked at that time, actually I'm not feeling. For a while I probably did start feeling, really feeling, and then telling them how I felt. And we get smart about these things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's go back to, there's only 10 minutes, so that's good. So if anyone has something they want to bring up, now's the time. But just to bring it back to the core teaching, because on these retreats we have an extended period of time so we can start visiting some side areas and going into things in a little more detail. But we don't want to get lost in some of these side areas without keeping it in the context of the main framework. Because everything that's said still fits back to this main framework. So if you can think of anything that I've said over the last few days and you say, I don't know how that fits into the framework, then ask, because I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to fit it into the framework and see where it supports what's being said in the framework. And that's really the only reason for all of the elaborations. So remembering, this spiritual search needs to deliver something practical, something in daily living. Otherwise, what is the point? Like, I couldn't care less if this search was about some philosophy, and I became very knowledgeable about a philosophy, and I could then enter into debates and arguments with people because I've gone through a spiritual search that has given me information about the universe, knowledge about the universe, which is essentially just knowledge. I wouldn't see any benefit in it. So all this spiritual search needs to deliver something very, very substantial and practical in daily living. Otherwise, what's the point? And so substantial that the only thing that is worth really seeking for is happiness for the human being in this lifetime, continuous, unbroken happiness. And it can sound selfish, but actually it's far from selfish. It's you could say the purpose of life. Why do I say it's the purpose of life? It's the purpose of life on one level, according to, like, we can put an explanation to it, to support this suggestion, the purpose of life, is because when that happiness for the human being, which turns out to be continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of circumstance, when that's delivered, seeking stops. Searching for meaning stops. The question, what's the purpose, no longer makes sense. We have the answer. So when seeking meaning and seeking happiness stop, we need to see what's made it stop. That must be significant. And what's significant, what is there when stopping happens is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. So my conclusion is, the purpose of life is continuous, unbroken peace of mind, because when we get that, seeking for meaning stops. It means the goal has been fulfilled. So if the purpose of life was to be super successful, everyone who was successful would have fulfilled the meaning of life, and so they wouldn't seek anymore. But what happens is someone thinks the meaning of life is to be successful, so they spend a lifetime being successful, and the seeking, the uncomfortableness, doesn't go away, which means to me that the purpose of life is not success. The purpose of life is not more money. The purpose of life is not having certain relationships or anything that people get that doesn't fulfill is not the purpose of life. The only thing in my life that I've ever found fulfills is the absence of suffering, peace of mind. And so that's why the question is asked at the beginning, what are you really looking for? I'm answering it from my own experience. And in this, my own experience, it becomes very clear that humans are not different on this level. We're different, we're unique on a biological level, so what pleases someone is going to be different to what pleases the other. That's fine, that's on a biological level, but on a fundamental level, we're the same. And so the happiness, which is not circumstantial, turns out to be the same thing. It turns out to be an attitude to circumstance. So that's what we're really looking for. We become clear that I'm looking for peace of mind. And then our attention, hopefully as guided by a specific set of concepts, elaborates on what suffering is, which is what disturbs peace of mind, elaborates on the different forms of suffering and what is at the root of that suffering, what the core error is that life has put in place, the divine hypnosis that life has put in place. Elaborates on that in order for awareness and the working mind to see it for oneself, and that seeing, which you can't say, I want to see it today. Like if we say, I want to see it today, we're being unrealistic. The likelihood is we'll go about our life today and tomorrow And at some point during today and tomorrow, it will be seen, not because we want it to be seen, but because it's destined to be seen, and certain conditioning has been put in place that makes it evident, makes the various aspects of life as they arise, makes them evident, makes them recognized. And the recognizing of that is the undoing of the error, and the undoing of the error brings about what we're really looking for. The error is the ingrained belief, attachment to outcomes, and the belief in personal doership. I'm the doer and the other is the doer. We can see this is the error because when we describe the different forms of suffering, guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, and they're all based on these two beliefs, expectation and the belief I'm the doer. So when we hear a spiritual teaching and it says what is available is the end of suffering, if it's received and the attitude towards it is, I want that, I expect to get it, and I'm going to bring that about by my efforts. What that is I'm going to bring it about by my efforts. I am the doer. I want it, attachment to a particular outcome, and expectation. I'm attached to the outcome and I expect to get it. So as soon as that's the relationship to the concept that's put forward, that in itself is a whole lot of suffering. It may be inevitable that's going to happen, but the good news is that if the body is being programmed to register suffering in all its forms, as soon as that happens and suffering arises, at some point the suffering is going to be seen, and the doer principle that has snuck in the back door, has snuck in and taken hold of the very teachings that are undermining it, will still get undermined at some point. Because the teachings are pointing out what suffering looks like and on what basis it arises. So if the doer principle comes in the back door, it's going to create more suffering, awareness will land on it, and the working mind is going to say, what's happening here? And it might see, wow, without even knowing it, this description was turned into an objective. It's never how the process is going to unfold, such that a positive result is going to happen. It only unfolds when the doership principle starts falling away. And so when the working mind catches it and says, wow, look what's happened, that's the doership principle falling away. Not in totality, but in that particular expression. And that's a great thing, because once it starts being seen in all of its different forms. So feeling these energies, how does that link in to what we've just said? It links in because the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which I'm calling a belief, is stored in the body in these energetic forms. And so awareness at some point, which needs to become aware of all of the roots of doership and attachment to outcome, needs to become aware of what's in the subconscious. And the way that awareness becomes aware of what's in the subconscious is by what is in the subconscious coming into the conscious. The very nature of subconscious is awareness is not there. So what's in the subconscious needs to come into the conscious. And how we get to drag the things that are in the subconscious into the conscious is through this process, which links in with this feeling thing, is that take the analogy of an ocean with, I call it a buoy, in Australia it's called a buoy, right? But in America it's a buoy. So just in case someone's wondering what's a buoy. So a buoy or buoy, one of those things that floats on the water. So this is an analogy. And that buoy has a chain that goes to the very deep part of the ocean, and there's a big anchor or weight down there. And all the way along there are buoys suspended in the water on this chain. And the buoy on the water, on the surface, is one that we can see. It's what's in the conscious. So once we start feeling uncomfortable, once there's an uncomfortableness, and there's a particular circumstance where a thought arises, it says, I'm going to feel this, I'm at home alone, it's a great time for me to feel this. And let's say the feeling starts to get a little bit stronger, and we start putting some words onto it of what we think it might be, and it gets stronger still. And we get to feel that because it was on the surface. And in feeling it and expressing it, what might happen is we find that an anger about something, and what's on the surface is usually something that happened yesterday or last week or is happening right now. Someone hasn't done something and we're feeling hard done by. We express that, and what it turns into, this is if the timing is right, and usually we'll have the feeling, now I'm going to feel this, it feels like the time's right. If we'll feel the top layer, and what we might find is that the anger or the hatred that is expressed about what someone is doing in the present moment suddenly turns into an anger about something from 3 years ago. And when that happens, what has essentially happened is the buoy that was below the surface has now been dragged up to the surface. It's now in the conscious. And so we can start feeling this and realize, wow, that thing that happened 4 years ago, I'm not over it. And at least we understand, wow, that's a significant event. And next time, we might feel this uncomfortableness, and we might actually find ourselves going straight into that feeling again of something that happened 3 years ago. And if it gets expressed fully, with remembering our current attitude of non-doership, so watching all of the doership that's contained in it, just watching it come out, it might well reveal something below that, an event from 20 years ago. I go, wow, I really am not over that. And so that's how what is in the subconscious gets pulled up higher and higher. And we might find ourselves having experiences of events that happened long, long time ago. Maybe an event that I'm completely unaware of, an event of someone else's life. Right? Not my past life, but maybe it's a past life, I don't know. It's a memory, I don't know how it got there. I'm not even convinced it's of a past life, but I can't deny that there is a vision, let's say, that happens at a particular point in time of an event that is full of emotion. Like the emotion is in our system, and it comes out. And when it comes out, we have a vision, or somehow we understand what the story is about. An event of a person that is not me, and somehow it's in my system. So what? The so what is that it's in the system in the same way as events from this life are in the system. And events in this life and the way that we related to events in this life color how we relate to the present moment. And so maybe events from other lives, someone else's life, that somehow, cosmic law makes its way into this system, also contributes to how we are in the present moment. And as these energies come out, which might happen over years, when we least expect it, it's not a practice, it's just to be open to this when it presents. As those energies come out, the body tends to feel different, and we find that the way we relate to life can change radically. Something we simply couldn't stand at some point earlier, it becomes something that doesn't bother us. Why is that? Probably because the deeply ingrained attachment to outcomes, especially outcomes in relation to that sort of category of things that previously you couldn't feel comfortable with, that's been released. And now you find yourself okay with those sort of events, those sort of circumstances or outcomes.